The night Fiona Charest almost lost her job was the same night she saved a woman's life, though she didn't know either of those things when she arrived for her shift at 7 o'clock, her coat still damp from the rain, her locker key bent at an angle that made it stick every single time. Auberge Soleil was not the kind of restaurant where you arrived damp. It was the kind of restaurant where the maître d' pressed his lips together when a server's apron had a crease in it, where the sommelier could tell you the altitude at which a particular Burgundy grape had been grown, and where the menus had no prices printed on them. Because if you needed to ask, you probably shouldn't be there. The lighting was warm and deliberate. The tablecloths were changed between courses, not between seatings. It smelled of cedar and butter, and something faintly floral that Fiona had never been able to identify, even after 2 years of working there. She had studied biochemistry at McGill for 3 years before her mother got sick. That was the version she gave when people asked, the short version, the one that didn't require her to explain the 6 months she'd spent sleeping on a cousin's couch in Laval, or the medical bills that had arrived in envelopes so thick they felt like books, or the way her mother, Doreen, still apologized for it sometimes quietly, as though it had been a choice she'd made. Fiona had stopped her from apologizing. Fiona stopped Ita. She'd found Auberge Soleil through a friend of a friend, passed the trial shift through sheer precision and nerve, and stayed because the tips were good and the kitchen, for all its severity, ran like a system she understood. Variables, inputs, expected outcomes. What she had not expected on that particular Thursday in November was the woman at table 9. The reservation had come in under Whitmore, a name Fiona recognized. Gareth Whitmore's company had a floor of offices visible from the restaurant's east-facing windows, and his photograph appeared occasionally in the business section of papers that the restaurant stocked near the coat check. He was, by any reasonable measure, the kind of man Auberge Soleil existed to accommodate. He arrived at 7:40 with 2 associates and a woman Fiona didn't recognize. Older, perhaps 70, with silver hair cut short and close, and eyes that were an unusual shade of grey-green, watchful and very still. Fiona's section didn't include table 9. It included tables 12 through 16, which that evening held a retirement party for a woman named Jacqueline, who kept touching her own collarbone in disbelief, and a couple celebrating something they hadn't named, but which was clearly significant. They kept looking at each other, the way people do when they've made a decision that frightens and thrills them, equally. Fiona was good at reading tables. She'd had to become good at it because at Auberge Soleil you were expected to anticipate, not respond. She noticed the woman at table 9 because of the hands. The woman, Whitmore's guest, perhaps his mother, the age suggested it, had both hands resting on the edge of the table, in a way that was not idle. They moved in small, controlled ways, not fidgeting but expressing, and Fiona recognized it the way you recognize a word in a language you learned young and haven't spoken in years. Her brother Theo had been born deaf. Their mother had learned to sign at the same time Theo had, and Fiona had grown up in a household where hands were as fluent as mouths. She hadn't used AS language. Close enough to LSQ that the differences had never troubled her much in nearly 4 years, not since Theo had moved to Vancouver, found his people, built a life that no longer needed her as its interpreter, the woman at table 9 was signing. Not to anyone at the table, to herself, or to the air, or to some internal conversation Fiona couldn't hear. Small signs. Wait, again. Please. And no one at that table was watching her hands at all. Fiona didn't stop walking. She continued to table 14, refilled the water, noted that the man had chosen the halibut and was eating it without enthusiasm, filed that away. But her eyes kept returning to table 9, to the silver-haired woman who had looked at the menu for a very long time, and then set it down without any visible resolution. Gareth Whitmore was talking about something with animation. One of his associates had a tablet out, tilted at an angle, and the other was nodding in a rhythm that suggested he was paid to agree. No one had asked the woman what she wanted to drink. She had a water glass. That was all. It was Fiona's colleague, Dimitri, who was covering table 9. She caught him near the service station and said, quietly, "The older woman with Whitmore. Has she ordered?" Dimitri looked at her with the mild expression he reserved for questions he found unnecessary. "Whitmore's handling it. He ordered for the table. Has she communicated anything to you directly?" "She's Whitmore's mother. He said she doesn't." He paused, searching for phrasing. "He said she has some difficulty with communication. He handles it." Fiona nodded. She went back to her section. She thought about Theo at age 9, at a restaurant outside Gatineau, where their mother had ordered for him, and the waiter had brought chicken fingers he didn't want. And Theo had sat with those chicken fingers in front of him for the entire meal, too polite to say anything, his hands quiet in his lap because the waiter wouldn't have understood, even if he'd tried. She'd been 11. She remembered the quality of his silence. She'd thought about it many times since, in ways she couldn't quite articulate. The woman at table 9 had been given a salmon mousse amuse-bouche she had not touched. She was looking at it with an expression that was not distaste but something more complicated. Resignation, maybe. The kind of expression that has become habitual. At the 8:15 lull, when her tables were settled and the kitchen had absorbed the first wave, Fiona approached table 9. She did not go to Whitmore's side. She went to his mother's. She crouched slightly so she wasn't standing over the woman, bringing herself to eye level, and she signed, simply, "I'm sorry to interrupt. Can I get you something different?" The woman's reaction was not what Fiona expected. It was not surprise, exactly. It was something more like the expression of someone who has been in a dark room for a long time and has just heard, from behind a wall, a sound they recognize. Her hands moved immediately, with the fluency of a first language. "You sign." A little, Fiona signed back, which was technically true and practically an understatement. "What would you like to eat?" The woman's name, she learned, was Evelyn Whitmore, and what she wanted was not the salmon mousse or the lamb that Gareth had ordered for her, but the roasted beet salad she'd seen described on the menu and hadn't been able to ask for because no one at that table could understand her when she tried to tell them. She signed this in a rush, hands moving with the particular speed of someone releasing pressure that had been building for some time. And then she stopped and looked at Fiona with those grey-green eyes and signed something slower. "Thank you for asking." Fiona told Dimitri she'd be handling table 9's needs alongside her own section, and she said it in a tone that did not invite discussion. Dimitri shrugged. He was not unkind, just incurious. She brought Evelyn the beet salad. She brought her the herbal tisane she'd asked for, instead of the Bordeaux Gareth had ordered for the table. She stayed close enough to interpret when Evelyn wanted to participate in the conversation and found it useful. Which was not often, she noticed. Gareth spoke with great fluency about his upcoming expansion and the tax implications thereof, and Evelyn watched him with the patient attention of someone who loves a person they've mostly stopped expecting to understand them. At one point, one of the associates said something that made Gareth laugh, and Gareth turned to his mother and summarized it in a way that was clearly abbreviated, clearly cheerful, and clearly missing whatever the actual point had been. Evelyn nodded. Fiona refilled her water and thought, 3 years. That was what Dimitri had said in passing when she'd asked how long Evelyn had been deaf. An accident he'd heard from a previous shift, something sudden, 3 years ago. 3 years, and her son had not learned to sign. 3 years, and she sat at tables in his restaurants and ate whatever he ordered for her and nodded at jokes she couldn't follow. This was not, Fiona thought, a failure of love. It looked very much like a failure of imagination, the failure to imagine what it would feel like to be the only silent person in a loud room, night after night, because the people who loved you were busy. She was refilling Evelyn's water for the 3rd time when the incident happened. It was not dramatic in the way incidents at Auberge Soleil usually were. The wrong wine brought to the wrong table, the allergic reaction scare, the time a guest had accused Dimitri of racism when he'd been seating people in order of arrival. This was quieter, and because of that, more difficult to respond to. Fiona heard it before she turned around. The voice belonged to a woman who had appeared from the direction of the front entrance. Mid-40s, expensive coat, the kind of haircut that required regular maintenance. She was speaking to Gareth, and she was speaking in the tone of someone who considers a restaurant a setting for personal theatre. "I've been looking everywhere," she said. "You said 7:30. I've been waiting at the bar for 20 minutes. She reached across and touched Gareth's arm, then glanced at the table, and her gaze settled on Evelyn with something that was not quite warmth. "Evelyn, you look tired." Fiona noted that she did not sign this. She noted that she did not appear to intend to. Her name, Fiona would learn later, was Renata. Renata Foss. She'd been seeing Gareth Whitmore for 8 months, which was long enough to have opinions about his mother, and short enough that those opinions hadn't yet been tempered by consequence. Renata sat down in the empty chair, the chair Fiona had suspected was held for her, and immediately involved herself in the conversation with the associates with an ease that suggested she found business talk comfortable. She did not look at Evelyn again. She did not ask what Evelyn was eating or drinking or feeling. Evelyn looked at her plate. Fiona moved away to check on table 12, where Jacqueline's retirement party was reaching the point in the evening when someone was going to cry, and she was right. A colleague was already presenting a framed something, and Jacqueline had her hand pressed to her mouth. Fiona topped up the champagne flutes without being asked and thought, as she did, about what she'd seen at table 9. It was not abuse. She was careful about that word. What she'd seen was more ordinary and, perhaps because of that, more dispiriting. It was a woman who had lost something irreplaceable and was now managed, rather than known, by the people around her. The deafness was not the wound. The wound was the silence it had created, the way it had been allowed to grow until it was simply the shape of things. She was thinking this when she passed table 9 again, and Gareth, in a voice pitched to Carrie, "Has she seen Dr. Kaufman again? About the—" and here she made a small gesture with her hand that Fiona could only describe as dismissive. The episodes. Gareth's jaw tightened very tight. Gareth's jaw tightened very slightly. "We can talk about that later. I'm just saying the situation isn't sustainable. With your schedule." Renata adjusted her fork. "There are places that specialize in exactly this kind of thing. I've actually looked into a few." Evelyn was watching Renata's mouth. Fiona wasn't sure how much she could lip-read in dim restaurant lighting at that angle, but she thought, enough. Probably enough. Evelyn's hands had gone very still. Fiona continued past the table, set the water pitcher down at the service station, and stood there for a moment with her hand on the cool metal, thinking about variables, about what she knew, what she didn't know, what she could do, and what would happen to her if she did it wrong. She had $3,400 left in her mother's medical account. Doreen had another Infagian cycle in January. The tips from Auberge Soleil were the only reason the math currently worked. She went back to table 9 anyway. She refilled Evelyn's water. It didn't need refilling, and as she did, She crouched briefly beside her chair, angled away from Renata's sightline, and signed, "Are you all right?" Evelyn looked at her for a long moment, and then she signed, small and careful. "She wants to put me somewhere." Fiona kept her expression neutral, with the effort of someone who has learned to do that under pressure. "Your son doesn't know?" Evelyn's mouth curved in a way that was not a smile. "He's very busy." There was a whole world in that answer. Fiona had grown up adjacent to versions of it. The things people said when they'd learned not to ask for more than was available, when they'd made their peace with the distance and were trying, generously and at some personal cost, not to make anyone feel badly about it. She stood up. She went to the service station. She stood there for 40 seconds, which she knew because she counted, and then she made a decision that she understood might cost her her job. She went to find Margot. Margot Theberge was the floor manager at Auberge Soleil and had been for 11 years. She was not warm in the way that hospitality managers in films were warm. She was precise, watchful, and fair in the specific way of someone who has seen every variety of human behavior in a service context and has developed a classification system for all of it. Fiona respected her more than she respected most people she'd ever worked for. "I need to speak to you about a situation," Fiona said. "Table 9. Margot's expression did not change. "You're not covering table 9. "I know." They stepped into the small corridor behind the coat check, and Fiona told her. Not all of it. She didn't have all of it, but what she'd observed, the woman who couldn't communicate with anyone at her own table. The conversation she'd overheard, the way Evelyn's hands had gone still. Margot listened without interrupting, which was one of her better qualities. "What is it you're asking me to do?" she said when Fiona finished. "I don't know exactly," Fiona admitted. I think someone should speak to the son, not about the girlfriend, about his mother, about the fact that his mother has been sitting at tables in his presence for 3 years and hasn't been able to order her own food." Margot looked at her with the expression Fiona associated with a very particular kind of evaluation. "You understand that's not our role." "I understand that. And you're suggesting it anyway," she told me, Fiona said, "that the girlfriend wants to put her somewhere. I think she meant a facility. I think she was telling me because there wasn't anyone else to tell." The corridor was quiet. From the dining room came the soft percussion of silverware and conversation, the sound of Jacqueline's retirement party reaching its emotional apex. Margot said, "Finish your section. I'll handle table 9. Fiona went back to her tables. She watched from a careful distance as Margot approached table 9, not Gareth Whitmore's side, but Evelyn's. She watched Margot crouch, the way Fiona had crouched, though Fiona doubted Margot could sign. She watched the two women communicate with the slow, deliberate effort of people working without a shared language. Evelyn's careful mouthed words, Margot's attentive lip-reading posture, a small notepad that appeared from Margot's jacket pocket. Then she watched Margot straighten, move to Gareth Whitmore's side, and speak to him quietly. His two associates excused themselves with the professional instinct of men who have learned to recognize when a conversation is no longer for them. Renata stayed. Fiona watched Gareth Whitmore's face. She'd expected resistance. She'd expected the smooth management of a man who was accustomed to managing things. What she saw instead was something she hadn't anticipated. The specific expression of someone encountering a truth they had been, at some level, aware of, but had not yet permitted themselves to examine. His jaw was very tight. His eyes moved to his mother, who was looking down at her beet salad with great attention. And then Renata said something. Fiona couldn't hear what, and Gareth turned to look at her with an expression Fiona could read from across a dining room, the expression of a man in the process of revising an assumption. He signed nothing because he had no signs, but he put his hand over his mother's on the table, and Evelyn looked up, and whatever passed between them in that moment didn't require language. Fiona turned back to table 12, where Jacqueline was crying now, happy tears, the kind that come from being genuinely seen after a long time of working without acknowledgement. Fiona handed her a linen napkin, the good ones, and Jacqueline took it and laughed at herself and said, "I promised I wouldn't." And Fiona said, "They always say that," and meant it kindly. She did not know, when she walked out of Auberge Soleil at 11:40 that night, whether she still had a job. Margot had said nothing further to her. Gareth Whitmore had said nothing. The table had finished their evening with a quietness that was different from the earlier quietness, less like exclusion, more like something being carefully held. Margot called her the next morning before her shift. "Whitmore has requested you specifically," she said, without preamble, "for his family reservations going forward. He's also made a substantial donation to the restaurant staff appreciation fund, which is a pause unusual but not unwelcome." Fiona sat with this for a moment. "Am I still employed?" "Obviously." Margot sounded briefly affronted. "I told you I would handle it." "I handled it." "What did you tell him?" The truth, that his mother had been sitting at his tables for 3 years without being able to ask for what she needed. That one of my servers noticed when no one else did, because she had reason to understand what that silence looks like. A pause. "He asked about you. I told him about your brother." Fiona looked out the window of her apartment. November in Montréal had stripped the trees bare, and the sky was the color of old silver, and she thought about Theo in Vancouver, probably awake already because he rose early, probably making coffee in the kitchen of the apartment he shared with his partner, living his full and articulate life in the language their mother had given both of them. "He's going to learn to sign," Margot said. "He told me. I don't know if people follow through on things they say in restaurants, but he seemed like someone who meant it." "Does Renata know that?" The pause was brief. She was not invited to that particular conversation. That evening, when Fiona arrived for her shift, there was a card in her locker. It was cream-colored, expensive, with no name on the envelope, only her name, handwritten in the careful capitals of someone who was not accustomed to written communication and had perhaps tried harder because of that. Inside was a short note she read once and then tucked into the interior pocket of her bag, where she kept things she wanted to keep. It was from Evelyn. It said, "I have not been asked what I wanted in a very long time. You asked. Thank you." And below that, in careful, slightly uneven letters, the way someone writes a word in a language they are only beginning to learn. Smercy. Fiona stood at her locker for a moment with the card in her hands. Then she straightened her apron, checked that the key was in her pocket, pressed it into the lock the way you had to, firmly, and at a slight angle, and went out to the floor. The restaurant was already filling. The light was warm and deliberate. Somewhere in the kitchen, something was reducing in a pan, sending up a smell of wine and shallots, and something faintly herbal she'd never quite been able to name. She moved through the room with the particular attentiveness she brought to every shift, watchful, unhurried, reading the tables the way she'd always read them, and thought that sometimes the most important thing you could do for another person was simply to notice that they were trying to say something and stop long enough to listen in the right language.